Well, good morning, everyone. Today we will continue on with our BU seminarians sharing for the last few weeks. For those who have tuned in on Wednesday, we've been having some great papers and discussions. And so today we'll start our BU seminarian students who are not presenting a paper but sharing their call story. So to lead us off this morning is Chastity Jones, and she will share her call story with us. So Chastity, take us away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna dive right in because there's a lot to cover. And just as like a warning, or like kind of like a warning that my call story is very much entangled with my racial identity. So there's going to be a lot of that in my presentation. The first slide, I'm originally from the Bible Belt, Mandeville, Louisiana. It's right across the lake from New Orleans. So I was born and raised there, lived there until I was 24 years old. When I was 24 years old, I was commissioned as a missionary, a young adult missionary by the United Methodist Church's Global Mission Fellows. And I had a few experiences of being a missionary in Cambodia. I went there 3 times, and we prayed, we preached, we evangelized in a very specific way because of Cambodia's faith and politics makeup. And so when I signed up to be a missionary, that's what I wanted to do. And that's what I thought a missionary was I was going to go abroad somewhere and pray and preach and evangelize and disciple. And so this is a picture of when my last time being in Cambodia with some friends that I had brought with me and some friends that I had made because I had been there like to the same places multiple times, which I would highly recommend for like short-term mission trips, is like building relationships. So before I got commissioned as a missionary, they brought us all to Atlanta for a 3-week training. And that was where I had my definition of a missionary redefined. And that was also where I had my first anti-racism and anti-oppression workshop ever. Before that, I had been taught that racism was like an individualized thing, like someone hates you for the color of your skin, or you're discriminated against because of the color of your skin. And it was here that I was introduced to institutionalized racism and systematic racism. And it was also here that at 24 years old that I had, for the first time in my life, this is going to sound really strange, but I had a conscious realization that I was Black and a Black woman. And so that freaked me out because I had to figure out what that meant, and what were the implications of me being a Black woman, especially during this time. This was 2016, around the time of the elections. There were a lot of unarmed Black folk being murdered by the police. So it was very, very I also had to deal with a lot of racism from my past that I had suppressed for the last 24 years that all came to the surface that I had to deal with all at once. So it was a very painful process. So they tried to match us with placement sites according to our education and interests. And I ended up being matched instead of somewhere abroad in Seattle, Washington, as a community organizer for an interfaith-based advocacy organization called Faith Action Network. Okay, so I started processing a lot of things in the trainings that I had to unpack my entire 2 years commitment as a Global Mission Fellow, and a lot of these things I'm still processing now. So the trainings helped me become aware that I had a lot of self-hatred and hatred of just Blackness and Black things associated with Blackness. I was struggling with internalized depression and ashamed of Blackness and being a part of the Black community. It also helped me slowly become aware of a lot of conservative evangelical theologies that were conditioning me and were continuously associating whiteness with divinity, purity, royalty, and authority, and continuously associating Blackness with evil, anger, danger, ugly, etc. And so I realized that these theologies and this religious language reinforced how I felt about myself, basically, which was, associated with Blackness. So also I have white Jesus here because there is, I've done a lot of work around white Jesus and around deconstructing, decolonizing Christianity and thinking about how white Jesus is harmful to people of color. And so all the Jesuses that I've ever seen were white. They were white in Cambodia. They were white in my Black churches. They were white in my white churches. And I actually have a sermon about white Jesus, and it's called My Powerful Case for the Black Jesus. And I will make sure that I send that and make that available. So I go to Seattle. I'm from the Bible Belt, Louisiana. It's a huge culture shock. It's Seattle is one of the most progressive places in the country. I lived in Capitol Hill, which they call the Gayborhood. There's rainbow flags everywhere, rainbow pave walks. And I'm meeting members of the LGBTQ communities for the first time. I'm meeting people of different faiths because I'm working at an interfaith organization. I'm being exposed to so many philosophies and theologies and different ways of thinking and living life. It was incredibly shocking, to say the least. So I began a process of liberation. I also call it a decolonization process, which is unlearning of colonial mindsets and patterns. So I began to decolonize my mind and my spirituality by thinking of the ways that I have been impacted and my people have been impacted by colonialism, and unlearning those, thinking of Jesus as white as one example, hating myself and hating Black things as another example. So I surrounded myself with positive images of Black people on my social media, in my room. I embraced my natural hair instead of chemically restraightening it. I cut all my hair off right before I moved to Seattle. This was a huge rebirth almost. And seeing my hair the way that God created my hair for the first time in a long time, and having to learn how to deal with it all over again and learn it and love it was a huge part of that process. I also started practicing yoga, which kind of taught me a lot about self-liberation and self-love. It was an awesome place for me to process a lot of these thoughts and things that I was being exposed to. So this was an extremely liberating process, but it was also an extremely painful process because, like I said, I was addressing so many things from the past that I had suppressed. And I also became like super hyper aware of the implications of being a Black woman in this country. So during that time, I was wrestling with a lot of things. I was wrestling with why unarmed Black people were being murdered by the police. This was in 2016. And that was the year that Alton Sterling was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which was like so close to home. And my church, which when I was in Louisiana, I was going to like a mega church, conservative evangelical church. They were intentionally preaching about obeying authority. They were talking about Blue Lives Matter, and they never acknowledged the impact of Black people like during this time. I was wrestling with how racist people and Black people could believe in the same God. I was wrestling with was God on the side of my people? Who is God? Is God real? I was asking myself, like, the things that I've always been taught about God and the things that I've always been taught that were important to God, if they were really important to God or if they were important to the community that I was a part of. So I was super, 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 and before this, my faith had been like the foundation of my life. So I experienced an extreme faith crisis, and it led to like a lot of like mental health issues, and I had to go to therapy, and it was crazy. Okay, so yes. So I was asking these questions so much, and everywhere I went, I literally had a coworker one day who was like, hey, have you heard of Black liberation theology? James Cone asked a lot of these questions. And I was like, no, I never heard of that. So he recommended me James Cone, and he was like a seminary student, and he had learned some of these things at Yale. And so I started reading Black liberation theology, womanist theology, Black feminism. I started listening and attending talks. I got to go to a talk by Angela Davis. I started learning more about Black history from the side of Black people, from the perspective of Black people. I started thinking about God as more than like a white man floating in the sky, and like thinking of just like, I don't know, God in a way that I could relate to God, which as a Black woman would be a Black woman. And then I was able to like find radical pro-Black communities in Seattle, which is surprising because there's like 4% Black people in Seattle, and it's dropping because of the gentrification. But despite all that, and maybe because of all that, the Black community was like is super, super tight-knit community. So all these like really helped to empower me. Yeah. And as a result, I decided to go to theology school to explore some of these themes more, and to like continue my own liberation process, but hopefully like invite others into the liberation process. In January, I began my ordination process with the United Methodist Church in the Pacific Northwest. They really inspired me because a lot of the clergy and a lot of the pastors were at the protests, in the streets, like at the meetings with the senators. And that was the first time that I saw a really different archetype of what clergy could be, of what Christian people could be. And that really inspired me to continue being a part of the church, because I really was trying to decide if I wanted to abandon the church or continue to be a part of it. I consider myself, and probably always will consider myself, an activist first and foremost, no matter what I like my vocation is, and no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm writing books or preaching or practicing yoga or teaching yoga, like that's what I consider myself. A participant in the Black liberation struggle. I, through this process, became a lover of Black people and the Black community unapologetically. I became empowered, strong, liberated, inquisitive. And I put passionate on here, even though I was passionate before, but my passion was a little dispersed, but now it's like super focused. And then, yeah, this final picture is a picture of, I got to preach at the School of Theology in November. And it was the top, basically, I forgot the title, but it was about police brutality. And then immediately following the service, we had a vigil for two people who had just been killed by the police. And that was an extremely powerful day. It was an extremely powerful sermon. A lot of people participated in the service that we planned. And I know for a fact that that person in that picture and everything that happened wouldn't have happened, or I wouldn't be this person if I hadn't gone through all those things that I just talked about. So yes, that is the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Personally, I loved hearing your story. And we have 43 seconds left. So, and just, I went to school in Seattle. I actually lived there for 5 years. It is, even though I was born and raised in California, Boston is my home, but Seattle is definitely my second love. So I'm so glad that it treated you so well. And if you go back, I know some amazing places where you get food at. So we'll chat
Okay.
any final words for our parishioners today before we head into worship?
Wow. Just thank you for having me. And I appreciate the opportunity to share and to kind of like relive all that, especially right now because I feel so far away from Seattle and everything that's happening in the streets with the protests. And it was good to see, like, yeah, I think it was good for me to share as well.
Good. Well, I'm glad it was a blessing for you because it was definitely a blessing for us. And if you would send me a link, we'll put your presentation on the website so people can go back and see some of those amazing pictures as well. So blessings to you, Chastity. Thank you so much for joining in.